Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, a place where stories of fathers, families, and the quiet truths of life come alive. If you believe that every family carries untold stories, and if you value lessons that linger long after the last word is spoken, then I invite you to stay with us. Don't forget to subscribe, so you'll never miss a story that might just echo your own heart. Today's story is titled, "My daughter-in-law took $20 million and threw me out. Days later she begged for help." And it begins on a day no father ever wishes to see, the day he buries his only son. The church was heavy with silence. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that sits on your chest like a stone, pressing until your breath grows shallow. Richard Cole sat in the front pew, his hands folded on his lap, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the wooden coffin that held his son Michael. He was 62 years old, a widower for nearly a decade, and now, suddenly, brutally, without the boy who had once been his reason for pressing forward each morning. The organ played a slow hymn, voices of mourners rose, but none of it seemed to reach Richard. He was somewhere between the echo of the past and the weight of the present. He thought of Michael's childhood, the way his boy once ran across the yard barefoot, laughing, chasing fireflies in the twilight. He thought of the way Michael, as a teenager, stubbornly stayed up late with him in the workshop, sanding planks of cedar until their hands were covered with dust. And he thought of the last conversation they shared, Michael telling him, "Dad, don't worry. If anything ever happens to me, I've made sure you'll be okay." Now here he sat, wondering what those words had meant, staring at the coffin as if it might open and give his son back. Beside him, a small hand slipped into his own. Emma, his 10-year-old granddaughter, leaned against him, her dark hair falling over tear-streaked cheeks. "Grandpa," she whispered, "Daddy's not coming back, right?" Richard swallowed hard, his throat a knot. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, "Daddy's with your grandma now. They're both watching over you." On the other side of the aisle sat Samantha, his daughter-in-law. She wore black as custom demanded, but the way she carried herself was not of a grieving widow. Her posture was rigid, her eyes dry. When she spoke with others, her voice was clear, firm, almost businesslike. People noticed it, whispered about it, but grief comes in strange forms and no one dared question hers. The service ended. The coffin was lowered. Dirt thudded against the wood, and each sound was like a hammer against Richard's chest. He whispered a prayer, kissed his fingers, and pressed them against the cold earth before walking away with Emma in tow. That night, the family gathered at Michael's house. The house Richard had once helped him buy. It was filled with people. Neighbors bringing casseroles, co-workers offering condolences, distant relatives shaking hands and muttering, "If you need anything." Richard sat in a corner, exhausted, trying to stay invisible. He didn't want to talk. He only wanted to hold onto the fragments of his son, in the smell of his clothes, in the photographs on the walls, in the echoes of laughter that still seemed to live in the rooms. But then Samantha stood in the center of the living room, cleared her throat and raised her voice. The crowd quieted. "I want to thank everyone for coming," she began. "Michael's passing was unexpected, but life must go on. Thankfully, he left us secure. His insurance came through, $20 million. With that, Emma and I will be fine." There was a pause, a murmur through the crowd. Richard looked up sharply. 20 million. He hadn't known the number. He had known Michael took out a policy, but not this. Samantha's tone hardened as her eyes flicked toward him. "From this point on, decisions regarding the estate, the house, and the money will be mine alone. That's what Michael wanted." "Richard," She said his name like a formality, not like a father-in-law. "I think it's best you find somewhere else to stay. This is no longer your home." The room went utterly still. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Samantha and the old man in the corner. Richard blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Samantha didn't flinch. "Michael left this house to me. The policy names me as the beneficiary. You've done enough. It's time you move on." Emma gasped. She clung tighter to her grandfather's arm. "Mom, no," she cried. "Grandpa belongs here." Samantha ignored her. "This is final." Richard felt as if the ground had opened beneath him. Just hours ago he had buried his son. And now he was being buried alive in another way. Stripped of the last place that felt like home, the last tie to Michael's life. He looked around the room. No one met his eyes. Not one friend, not one relative spoke up. That was the cruelty of grief. It made people silent in the face of wrong. Slowly, Richard stood. His legs shook. He picked up his old coat from the arm of the chair, placed his worn hat on his head, and turned to Emma. He knelt to her level. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his eyes glistening, "I'll always be your grandpa. You'll always find me wherever I go." She hugged him tightly, sobbing into his chest. "Don't leave, Grandpa. Please don't leave." He kissed the top of her head, closed his eyes to keep his own tears from falling, and gently pried her arms from his neck. Then, without another word, he walked out the front door into the cold night air. Behind him, laughter slowly resumed, Samantha talking to guests about investments and plans. Richard could hear it fading as he stepped farther down the sidewalk, the sound cutting him deeper than the shovel of dirt on his son's grave. In that moment, he understood something with the clarity of lightning. Grief had two faces. His was love, hers was greed, and the battle between the two had only just begun. The night was bitter, though it was not winter yet. Richard walked with no destination, his old coat pulled tight around his shoulders. The street lamps flickered as if even the town itself could not bear to watch him shuffle past. A father stripped of his son, a man stripped of his home. He did not carry much, just the wallet in his pocket, a set of keys he no longer had reason to use, and the weight of memories that clung heavier than any bag. Each step felt like betrayal. The sidewalk beneath his feet was the same one he had walked countless times to visit Michael, to play with Emma, to carry groceries up the porch. Now it was an exile's path. He found a small bench near the park and lowered himself onto it. His knees ached, his chest burned with grief, but what hurt most was the echo of Emma's cry. "Don't leave, Grandpa, please don't leave." He buried his face in his hands. At 62, he thought he had weathered enough storms. The loss of his wife had nearly undone him, but Michael had kept him afloat. Together, father and son had filled the gaps with laughter, with sawdust-covered afternoons in the workshop, with Sunday dinners that always ended with Emma in his lap, tugging at his gray beard. Now all of it seemed gone in a single sweep. A coffin lowered into the ground, and a voice cold enough to send him into the night. He sat there until the street emptied and the houses grew dark. Finally, when the cold settled too deep into his bones, he stood and walked toward the edge of town, where a row of run-down motels sat under buzzing neon lights. He paid cash for a single room at the cheapest one, the kind where the carpet smelled of smoke and the curtains never quite closed. It didn't matter. It was a roof, a bed, a place to close his eyes and pretend for a few hours that the world had not broken. In the morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the curtains. Richard woke stiff, the bed lumpy, but he rose anyway. He had nowhere to be, no one waiting for him. He made himself a cup of coffee from the lobby pot, sat at a small plastic table, and stared at the steam as though it might reveal what he was supposed to do next. By midday, he could not help himself. He walked back toward Michael's house. Not to go inside, he knew better now, but to see Emma. He hoped maybe, just maybe, she would catch sight of him through the window. He stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets. The blinds were open. Inside, Samantha's voice carried, sharp and commanding. She was on the phone, pacing back and forth in the living room. Richard couldn't make out all the words, but fragments drifted out. Investment, property deal, luxury car delivery. Then he saw Emma. She sat at the kitchen table, her chin resting on her palm, homework untouched. Her eyes looked empty, as if she had aged years overnight. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to cross the street, knock on the door, scoop her into his arms. But the memory of Samantha's glare held him back. He turned away, walking before anyone noticed him. The days that followed blurred. Samantha hosted parties, her driveway crowded with expensive cars. Photos of champagne glasses and designer dresses appeared online, each tagged with glowing captions. The insurance money flowed like water through her hands, and she drank greedily, never pausing to think of the well that might run dry. Richard, meanwhile, lived quietly. He took small day jobs fixing fences, patching roofs, sharpening tools. People paid him in cash, sometimes in meals. He told no one about what had happened, not out of shame, but because the wound was too raw to press with words. At night in the motel, he spoke softly to the ceiling as though Michael might still hear. "Son, I don't know what you thought you secured for me, but I'll keep my promise to watch over Emma, even if I have to do it from the shadows." One evening, after repairing a neighbor's porch, Richard passed by the house again. This time, the blinds were drawn, but the curtains parted just enough for him to see Emma pressed against her bedroom window. When she spotted him, her face lit up, and she mouthed a single word, "Grandpa." Richard lifted a hand in greeting, his eyes warm though wet. She pressed her hand against the glass, and for a moment it was as though the wall between them didn't exist. But then Samantha entered the room, yanked the curtains shut, and Emma was gone. Richard stood there long after the window went dark. He whispered into the night, "I'll wait, Emma, I'll always wait." But as he walked back toward his rented room, a thought he could not shake began to stir inside him. Michael's last words, "Dad, don't worry. If anything ever happens to me, I've made sure you'll be okay." What had Michael meant? Richard didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question would unravel everything Samantha thought she had secured and restore what Richard thought he had lost forever. The days grew into weeks, and Richard learned the quiet routines of survival. He woke before dawn in his motel room, his body stiff from the thin mattress, his spirit heavy from the silence. He took whatever odd jobs he could find, mending a gate, repairing a leaky pipe, sanding a neighbor's deck. His hands, calloused long ago in the workshop with Michael, still knew the rhythm of labor. But the work was not what weighed him down. It was the absence. Each morning he reached for his phone before remembering there was no one left to call. No son to check in with, no wife to share coffee, no granddaughter allowed to visit. He ate simple meals, bread, soup, sometimes nothing at all. And when the day ended, he sat in his room listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of laughter from people outside who still had homes to return to. He did not complain. Not to the motel clerk who eyed him with suspicion, not to the neighbors who offered him small tasks, not even to the church pastor who asked once if he needed help. Richard simply shook his head, smiled faintly, and said, "I'll be fine." But fine was a word that did not belong to him anymore. On a Saturday afternoon, after finishing a job fixing shingles, Richard walked past the local diner where he and Michael once ate pie after long days of work. He stopped at the window, staring at the booth where his son had once laughed so hard that coffee spilled from his cup. The memory pressed into him, sharp as glass. Inside, families gathered, children tugging at sleeves, parents scolding gently, waitresses balancing plates. He watched until the ache became unbearable, then turned away, his boots heavy on the sidewalk. That night, unable to sleep, Richard opened the drawer of the motel nightstand. Inside was his old leather-bound Bible, worn from years of use. A picture of Michael fell out, one he'd tucked between the pages long ago. It was Michael at 16, holding up the first birdhouse they had built together. His smile was wide, his eyes bright with pride. Richard traced the edges of the photo with his thumb. "I'm trying, son," he whispered. "I'm trying to keep going, but it feels like I'm walking with only half of me left." Across town, Samantha's world spun differently. She hosted dinner parties in Michael's house, the sound of glasses clinking and music echoing late into the night. Expensive cars lined the driveway. Jewelry glittered on her wrists. Laughter fell from her lips like it had never known sorrow. But not all laughter rang true. Emma grew quieter with each passing day. At school, she avoided her friends. At home, she retreated to her room, hugging the old teddy bear her father once gave her. Sometimes she whispered to it as though it were her grandfather, telling it how much she missed him, how she wished her mother would stop pretending everything was fine. Richard didn't know the details, but he felt them in his bones. He knew the way children carried grief, silent, heavy, like a shadow that grew longer each day. And so, every evening, he walked the sidewalk near Michael's house. Not close enough to intrude, but near enough to catch a glimpse of Emma if she pressed her face against the glass. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she drew little hearts on the fogged-up window with her finger, and Richard would answer with a wave, his chest swelling with both love and sorrow. He never shouted, never demanded. His presence was his protest. Quiet, patient, unyielding. Yet inside his silence, a seed was growing. One night, after a long day repairing a barn outside town, Richard returned to his motel room and found an envelope slipped under the door. No name, no note, just a plain envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. It was from David Miller, the lawyer, an old friend he hadn't seen since the funeral. The note was short, written in David's steady hand. "Richard, there are things you need to know about Michael's estate. Call me." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in his hands. He read it again and again as though the words might change. His heart beat faster, hope and fear tangling in his chest. Michael's last words returned to him. "Dad, don't worry. If anything ever happens to me, I've made sure you'll be okay." For weeks, Richard had carried those words like a riddle. Now perhaps the answer was within reach. But even as a flicker of light touched his darkness, Richard knew the path ahead would not be simple. Samantha had built her world on Michael's death, and she would not surrender it quietly. The house that once carried the quiet hum of Michael's life had changed its rhythm. No longer did the smell of wood polish drift from the garage where father and son once worked. No longer did Sunday dinners fill the kitchen with roasted chicken and the sound of Emma's laughter spilling down the hallway. Now the house pulsed with music, with perfume, with the clinking of champagne glasses late into the night. Samantha had transformed mourning into spectacle. In the weeks after the funeral, she filled the rooms with guests, men in sharp suits, women in gowns that shimmered under chandelier light. There were cars parked along the driveway, some borrowed, some bought outright with cash from the insurance payout. Every evening seemed like a celebration, as though Michael's death were not a tragedy but an inheritance to flaunt. Neighbors noticed. They whispered in grocery aisles and on porches. "It doesn't seem right, does it? So soon, and with so much money." But whispers were all they ever were. No one dared confront her. People rarely stood against wealth when it paraded itself with confidence. Inside those gatherings, Samantha thrived. She laughed with abandon, her wine glass always full, her hands flashing with new jewelry. She spoke about investments as if she had spent her whole life studying finance, though her words were little more than rehearsed fragments from brokers. She barely understood. But behind the glitter, behind the laughter, sat Emma, alone at the staircase, clutching her teddy bear, her small face half hidden in shadow. Sometimes she was sent upstairs to bed before the parties began. Other times she lingered at the top of the stairs, peering down at a world that no longer had room for her grief. Once, Richard passed by on one of his evening walks. He stopped under the oak tree across the street. Through the tall front window he saw the glow of chandeliers, the silhouettes of dancing, the swirl of dresses. And then, at the very edge of the curtain, he caught sight of Emma's face. She pressed her cheek to the glass, her eyes finding him through the blur of music and laughter. She lifted her hand, slow and deliberate, a small wave in the middle of a storm. Richard's heart clenched. He raised his hand in return, holding it steady in the cool night air. Their silent exchange lasted only a few seconds before Samantha swept into the room, pulled the curtain shut, and the window went dark. Richard lowered his arm slowly like a flag at half-mast. The following day he walked into town for work. On Main Street, posters advertised community fundraisers, yard sales, school bake-offs, ordinary life. He envied its simplicity. At the diner, a man reading the paper leaned toward a friend and muttered, "Did you see Samantha's new car? Red convertible, cost more than my house." The friend shook his head. Some people just don't know when enough is enough. Richard sipped his black coffee quietly in the corner. He didn't speak, but his mind burned. He had built his life on the belief that love and labor were enough, that if you worked hard, stayed true, cared for your family, the world would grant you peace. Yet here he sat, invisible, while the woman who cast him out lived like royalty on the ashes of his son's life. That night, in the motel, he unfolded David Miller's note again. "There are things you need to know about Michael's estate. Call me." The words echoed louder now. Richard's heart wrestled with two truths. One, that Michael had left something behind for him, some safeguard buried in paperwork. And two, that confronting Samantha meant stepping back into a house where greed reigned louder than grief. He stared at his phone for a long while before finally dialing David's number. The lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar. "Richard, I hoped you'd call." There was silence on Richard's end, only the sound of his breath. Finally, he said, "You wrote me, said there are things I need to know." David exhaled. "Yes, meet me tomorrow morning, my office, 10 o'clock, we'll talk there." Richard hung up and sat still for a long time. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room, steady and low. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights flashing across the thin curtains. He looked at the photo of Michael still resting on the nightstand. "Son," he whispered, "I don't know what you left me, but tomorrow I'll find out." Meanwhile, across town, Samantha clinked glasses with friends. The convertible sat in the driveway, its paint gleaming under the porch lights. Laughter spilled out of the windows. But in her bedroom, Emma lay awake, listening to it all with wide, sleepless eyes. She pressed her teddy bear close and whispered into the dark, "Grandpa, please don't give up." And though walls and distance kept them apart, somehow Richard heard her, not through ears, but through the same quiet bond that always tied fathers and children, grandfathers and grandchildren. For the first time since the funeral, he felt the faintest flicker of strength return. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of day where the clouds seemed to hang lower than the church steeples. Richard dressed in his best shirt, the only one he owned that still held a crispness to it, and walked into town. His boots tapped against the cracked sidewalks as he made his way toward the small brick building on the corner. Miller and Associates, attorneys at law. David Miller was waiting for him. Though they were close in age, David had kept more of his color, his hair still streaked with silver rather than white. He rose from behind his desk when Richard entered, his face softening with genuine warmth. "Richard," he said, extending his hand. "I'm sorry it took me this long to reach out. I didn't want to overwhelm you after the funeral." Richard shook his hand firmly, though his grip trembled. "I've been overwhelmed already," he admitted. David gestured for him to sit. The office smelled faintly of paper and old books, the walls lined with certificates and photographs. His children, his wife, his years of service in town. Behind him, a window overlooked Main Street where people bustled by, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding in that room. David opened a drawer and pulled out a file. He placed it on the desk between them. "Michael came to see me 6 months before the accident. He was thoughtful, Richard, more thoughtful than most men his age. He wanted to make sure Emma was secure, of course, but he also worried about you. He told me, 'Dad has given me everything. I need to leave something behind for him.'" Richard's throat tightened. He stared at the file, unable to speak. David continued, his voice steady. "The life insurance policy was large, 20 million, yes. And Samantha is indeed listed as the primary beneficiary. But Michael added a clause most people would overlook. He set aside a trust, hidden within the paperwork, designed for Emma's future. And until she reaches adulthood, that trust is to be managed by one person only, you." Richard blinked. The words felt too heavy, too unexpected. "Me." "But Samantha said," she said everything was hers. David shook his head. "She either didn't read carefully or she thought you wouldn't. But the papers are clear. Samantha has access to the bulk of the insurance money, yes, but not all of it. 10 million is locked in Emma's trust. And you, Richard, are the trustee. The law recognizes you as the one responsible for it. That cannot be changed." Silence stretched. Richard gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Relief, grief, and fear tangled inside him. His son had thought of him. His son had trusted him. But this revelation meant stepping into a fight he had not wanted. "David," Richard whispered, "she'll hate me more than she already does." David leaned forward, his gaze firm. "Richard, you've been quiet long enough. This is not about Samantha. This is about Emma. You were cast out of that house, but Michael left you the key to protect what matters most. Do not let greed swallow your granddaughter's future." The words struck him like a hammer to the chest. He thought of Emma's small hand pressed against the window, her whispered plea into the night, "Grandpa, please don't give up." Richard sat back, his breath shaky. For weeks he had endured silently, believing he had lost everything. Now he realized he had not lost it all. Michael had seen further than the grave. He had left behind not just money, but trust, faith, a mission for his father to carry on. He reached for the file, holding it carefully, reverently, as though it were a piece of his son's voice returned to him. "Thank you, David," he said, his voice stronger now, "for keeping this safe." David nodded. The question now is, what will you do with it? Richard didn't answer right away. He stood, his back straighter than it had been in weeks. He slipped the file under his arm, placed his hat on his head, and looked out the window at the busy street. People hurried about with groceries, children tugging at hands, cars honking as they passed. Life moved forward, and so would he. That evening, Richard walked once more toward Michael's house. He did not step onto the porch, nor ring the bell. He stood across the street, watching as laughter spilled from inside, the lights glowing too brightly against the night. Samantha emerged briefly onto the porch, speaking into her phone, her new jewelry catching the light. Richard held the file tighter against his chest. For the first time since the funeral, he did not feel like an exile. He felt like a guardian. Inside those papers lay a truth Samantha could not erase. Half of the fortune was not hers to squander. Half of it was locked, waiting for Emma, waiting under Richard's steady hand. And soon enough, Samantha would learn that the father she thought she had discarded still held more power than she ever imagined. The house was louder than ever, yet underneath the music and chatter, cracks were beginning to form. Samantha's parties had grown bolder, her spending more reckless. A red convertible in the driveway, diamond bracelets glittering under every light, designer clothes arriving in boxes stacked on the porch. She moved through the rooms like a queen in her castle, but queens can be lonely too, especially when their power rests only on borrowed wealth. At first, her friends clapped for her extravagance. "Look at you, Samantha," they laughed, raising glasses, living the dream. But dreams have their limits. Within weeks, invitations were declined, excuses made. People grew tired of her boasting, her sharp tongue, the way she looked down even on those who once comforted her. The crowd that filled her house began to thin. The driveway, once lined with cars, now held only her own. And then came the bills. The bank called first, reminding her of the limits of even a $20 million cushion. There were investments she had signed without fully understanding, real estate ventures pitched by smooth-talking men who vanished the moment her money landed in their accounts. Credit card companies followed, their letters piling on the counter unopened. Samantha poured another glass of wine, turning the music louder to drown out the knocking at her door. Emma, meanwhile, grew smaller inside herself. She spoke little, played less, her schoolwork left undone. Teachers called concerned, but Samantha waved them off. "She's fine," she insisted. Just spoiled by her grandfather's attention. But the truth was clear to anyone who looked close enough. The child was wilting in a house filled with gold but starved of love. One evening, Richard walked his usual path past the house. It was quiet now, no parties, no laughter, the curtains drawn, the yard unkept. He stopped under the oak tree, sensing the shift. Something had changed. 2 nights later it happened. There was a knock at Richard's motel door, frantic and unrelenting. He rose from bed, his heart pounding, and opened it to find Samantha on the threshold. But she was not the Samantha of jeweled wrists and proud laughter. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes swollen from crying, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of the world had finally pressed her down. "Richard," she gasped, her voice breaking, "please, I need your help." He froze. The image of her standing in the living room after the funeral, telling him to leave, telling him the money was hers, flashed in his mind. He remembered Emma's tears, his own walk into the cold night. And now here she was, collapsed, desperate, begging. "What is it you want from me?" he asked, his voice steady but low. She clutched at his sleeve, trembling. "It's all gone," she cried. The money, it's tied up, the banks froze accounts, the investments failed. I can't pay the bills, I can't even keep the house. And Emma, her voice cracked, I don't know what to do. Richard studied her. For weeks he had lived in silence, carrying grief like a cross. Now grief stood before him wearing another face, greed stripped bare, pride turned to dust. "Why come to me?" he asked softly. "You made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Because you're the only one left," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "Everyone else has turned their backs. Please, please, Richard, help me." The moment hung heavy, the kind of moment that decides not just the course of a life, but the meaning of a legacy. He thought of Michael's words, "If anything happens, I've made sure you'll be okay." He thought of Emma's face in the window, her silent plea. And for the first time since that awful day at the funeral, Richard felt not just grief, not just loss, but the stirring of something stronger, justice, steady and quiet, waiting for its time. He stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in," he said at last. Samantha collapsed onto the chair, sobbing into her hands. Richard watched her, his face unreadable. He knew that tomorrow, the file David had given him would no longer be a secret, and Samantha was about to learn that the man she had cast aside was the very one holding the future she had nearly destroyed. Morning broke gray and damp. Rain tapped against the motel window, each drop steady as a clock, as though time itself had slowed to wait for Richard's decision. Samantha had fallen asleep in the chair, her body folded in on itself, the mascara from the night before smudged across her cheeks. She looked nothing like the woman who had once stood tall in glittering gowns, raising her glass while music filled Michael's house. Now she was smaller, fragile even, though the memory of her cruelty still lingered in Richard's chest like a scar that would not fade. He brewed coffee in the small pot, poured 2 cups and set one on the table beside her. The smell roused her and she blinked awake, disoriented. For a moment she seemed to forget where she was. Then she saw him, the man she had thrown out, the man she had despised, and shame colored her face. "Richard," she whispered, her voice raw, "I didn't know where else to go." He sat across from her, hands folded. His eyes were tired, yes, but no longer weak. There was a steadiness to him now, a quiet strength born of weeks in exile and the truth David had placed in his hands. "You knew where to go," he said calmly, "because deep down you knew Michael didn't leave you everything." Her head snapped up, confusion tightening her brow. "What are you talking about? The policy, the will, everything was in my name." Richard reached for the file he had kept so carefully, sliding it across the table. She hesitated before pulling it open. Her eyes darted across the pages, lips moving silently as she read. The color drained from her face. This can't be right," she stammered. "It's exactly right," Richard said. "Michael set aside half of it, 10 million for Emma, not for you, not for me, for her. And he trusted me to protect it until she's grown." Samantha's hands shook as she flipped through the documents. "But I already spent so much. I thought it was mine." Richard leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "That's where you were wrong. The money you squandered was never yours to flaunt. The house you filled with strangers was never meant to be your stage. Michael saw further than that. He knew you. And he knew Emma would need someone to guard what matters most." Tears filled her eyes, and for once, they seemed real. Not the performative tears of a woman at a funeral, but the desperate tears of someone facing the walls of her own making. She pressed her palms to her face. "What happens now?" Richard sat back, breathing slowly. "Now Emma's future is safe. The trust cannot be touched by your debts, your greed, or your mistakes. I will see to that. As for you, he paused, his gaze heavy but not unkind. What happens next depends on whether you learn to be a mother, not a collector of wealth. Samantha sobbed into her hands, her shoulders shaking. For a long time, the room was filled only with the sound of rain on the window and the muffled cries of a woman who had finally run out of defenses. Richard rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the wet street beyond. His reflection in the glass seemed older than he remembered, but also stronger, steadier. For weeks, he had carried grief like a weight, silent and crushing. Now, for the first time, he felt the burden shift. Justice, quiet and firm, had found its way through him. Behind him, Samantha's sobs quieted into hiccups. She spoke, her voice barely audible. "I don't deserve her forgiveness or yours." Richard turned, his eyes softening just slightly. "You don't," he said. "But Emma deserves a mother who tries, and I will not let her grow up believing love can be bought and discarded like yesterday's wine glass." She nodded weakly, clutching the file as though it were both a lifeline and a sentence. And in that moment, Richard understood something deeper. Justice was not about revenge. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that love and integrity had the final word. He thought of Michael, of his son's last words. "Dad, don't worry, I've made sure you'll be okay." And Richard whispered back, as though Michael might still be listening, "You were right, son. We'll be okay. Emma will be okay." Weeks passed. The storms that had battered Richard's heart began to ease, though the ache of losing Michael would never vanish completely. Grief never disappears. It simply learns to live beside us. Yet in those weeks, something unexpected had returned to him: purpose. The trust Michael had left for Emma was formally secured under Richard's guidance. The bank documents bore his name now, not as an owner, but as a guardian. $10 million sat quietly in accounts that could not be touched by greed, shielded from the recklessness that had nearly consumed everything. It was more than money. It was Michael's love, translated into a legacy that would carry Emma into adulthood. Samantha remained in the house, though the parties stopped, the champagne flutes packed away. The convertible disappeared from the driveway one morning, repossessed by the dealer who had sold it to her. The jewelry was gone too, traded back to cover debts. In its place came silence, and in that silence she began, haltingly, to see her daughter again. There were days she faltered, nights when the old habits whispered to her. But Richard kept close, not as an enemy, not even as a judge, but as the quiet reminder of what truly mattered. When she stumbled, his eyes reminded her of the man she had betrayed and the child who needed her. Emma blossomed again. With her grandfather present, her laughter returned in small bursts, like the first birds after winter. They spent afternoons in the park, Emma on the swings, Richard pushing gently, his heart lighter each time her laughter filled the air. In the evenings, she read to him from her school books, her voice steady, her eyes brightening when he listened with the patience only a grandfather could give. One Sunday, Richard walked her back to the house. Samantha met them at the door, her face drawn but softer than before. She looked at Richard, and for the first time there was no disdain, no false pride, only humility. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "Don't thank me, be there for her. That's thanks enough." That night, back in his motel room, he sat with the photo of Michael once more. He didn't speak this time. He simply looked, and in the stillness, he felt his son's presence, not as loss but as legacy. Michael had left him with more than grief. He had left him with trust, with responsibility, with love that extended beyond the grave. Richard understood now. The true inheritance wasn't the money, nor the house, nor even the trust fund. It was Emma's smile, Michael's memory, and the quiet justice that restored balance when the world had tilted too far. He placed the photo on the nightstand, switched off the lamp, and whispered into the dark, "We're going to be okay, son. She'll grow up knowing who her father was and what he stood for, and I'll be here until the last day I can." The rain had stopped outside. The night was quiet. For the first time since the funeral, Richard slept in peace. Thank you, dear friends, for walking with us through this story on Family Shadows. May it remind us all that money fades, but love and integrity endure. Wishing you and your family good health, happiness, and the kind of legacy that cannot be stolen. Don't forget to subscribe so you can join us again for the next story that just might echo in your own heart.